defenders of the faith. Welcome back to the Crossbow Catechist, a channel devoted to Catholic apologetics, Christian rhetoric, discourse, and debate. I'm your host, the Archer. Today, let's begin the process of dismantling one of the non-believers' most favorite tropes, the problem of suffering. In the last century, the non-believer's preferred go-to platitude was always evidence. There's no evidence for God's existence. But in this century, that strategy has been taking on water, so to speak, with the discovery of the overwhelming odds and probability against a godless universe without a designer, or the mind-numbing precision of epigenetic information being so, endlessly staggering. The secular voices have been forced to change their tune and search for a new approach or formula to deploy their critiques of both God and religion. It appears that they have decided to hitch their wagons to the suffering argument. It's very similar to the problem of evil, which we've already done an episode on, and we'll do many more. It's a slightly veiled attempt by the atheist to shift blame for the cruelty and suffering in this life to God instead of where it belongs, on us, on our decision to sin, on our decision to reject God. This is the core format of almost every atheistic dialogue. The non-believer plays the victim and tries desperately to accuse God of malice or neglect when pain and suffering in this life is a direct result of humanity's abuse of freedom, not God. So let's break down how the non-believer will usually present this argument. It follows the same pattern most of the time. They'll say something like, if God is all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful, then he must know about suffering in the world. So either he chooses to do nothing about it, or he can't do anything about it. Therefore, he is either not all-loving or not all-powerful, or maybe both. The answer to this setup is the non-believer has zero idea what an all-loving God would or wouldn't do. None. So you can break it apart with their setup. You don't even have to agree with that. Not even close. The non-believer has zero idea what an all-powerful deity would do or wouldn't. If God was all-loving, he would stop suffering. Says who? Where's that written? Where are you getting that from? You could look at the non-believer and say, you're not even an all-loving human being. You're filled with hate and bitterness, let alone an all-loving God. How do you know what an all-loving God would or would not do? You have no clue. The third premise of this is complete and total BS. And here's also another good one to point out when the atheist is listing all the things that God is. God's also perfect justice. People always conveniently leave that one out, if you've noticed. I mean, how do we know that the suffering in the world isn't exactly what it should be for the amount of sin and evil that we constantly pump into it? I mean, maybe it's just about right. How would the non-believer know? Here's another angle that you can also take. How does the skeptic know that God doesn't intervene? How would he know? Perhaps the world should be far, far worse than it is, as a consequence of the amount of sin and filth that we bring into it. Let's say that right now, 10 children out of 1,000 die every year of some childhood cancer. I don't know if that stat is right, but let's just go with it. 10 out of 1,000. Well, how do you know that that number shouldn't be much, much higher? Perhaps God intervenes and actually keeps that number low. Perhaps the amount of sin that we pollute the world with, the number should actually be closer to 431 children every year out of 1,000 die of cancer. How do you know? Half the children you see don't make it to adulthood. That's the way the world should be. But God intervenes and says, no, that's too much. I mean, how would we know? If God stops it before it happens, we would have no idea that it was supposed to have happened. Maybe if God lifted his hand from the world, men would rape and murder women 67% more than they do now. I mean, how do you know? How do you know what God stops and what he doesn't? Maybe if God lifted his hand from the world, there would be 49% more hurricanes, more tornadoes every year, and 78% more floods and natural disasters, ending in far more death and destruction. I mean, how do we know? How do you know what God stops and what he doesn't? What you're really asking is, what the atheist is really wanting to know is, why doesn't God stop all pain? Why doesn't he stop all suffering? Why doesn't he stop all violence, all murder, all disease, all death? Well, it's strange, but all God's asking you to do is not sin. I mean, that's really all he's asking. But the skeptic wants to be able to continue sinning, but not face any consequences of it. Real nice. Now, of course, God could stop all the suffering anytime he wants. All he'd have to do is stop the engine that produces the suffering, sin. Well, what is sin? Sin is the refusal to love and obey God. So God could at any moment force all of us to love him and obey him every second of every day, of every month, of every year, forever. And sin would end. There would be no more. And then from that, there would be no consequences of sin. No more age, no more death, no more natural disasters, no more violence, no more disease. But 5 seconds before God did that, a lot of people would call him a tyrant, forcing his creatures to love him, placing them in mindless bondage, stripping them of their free will. So God doesn't do that. He allows us to keep our freedom. And with that freedom, we reject him and we sin. God is responsible for the fact of freedom. We are responsible for our acts of freedom. Okay, well, that's a good foundation. We can come back and do a lot more. There's probably 20 more videos on suffering, but that's a good couple of angles to remember that you can always take when a skeptic or a critic is trying to play the victim by using the suffering card. Okay, well, let's move on to our J1Q. Our question today comes from Jillian. She asks, "Hey Archer, the record we have of Jesus' life and his miracles and teachings and resurrection really come from the 4 Gospels. Sure, there are other non-canonized Gospels and other letters and epistles written about him, but this is really what we have. And the problem with this is, how can we believe anything in them? Clearly, they are influenced and biased. They were written to convert people to Christianity, to belief in Jesus. They cannot be regarded as valid or historically accurate, considering the authors were all biased and prejudiced toward the spread of Christianity and the divinity of Christ." Okay. Well, Jillian, most of that is simply not true. None of it. I don't know how many history courses you've taken in college, but the overwhelming amount of ancient writing we have available to us today is all biased in some way or another. Some would even argue that modern history is much the same way. But just because an author is biased toward a certain subject or an idea or person does not necessarily mean they are going to not tell the truth. Say I write a book on Tom Brady, and I make it clear in the book that I'm a Tom Brady fan. I'm a supporter of Tom Brady. And I write a book and I say, Tom Brady has won more Super Bowls than any team in NFL history. Well, that would be true, wouldn't it? Even though I'm biased, the statement would still be true. Then if I said, Tom Brady has more playoff victories than any quarterback ever, well, see, that would also be true, wouldn't it? So just the fact that I'm biased doesn't mean that I still am not writing something that's valid. No, those two things are not the same. Well, I hope that helps. Thank you for the question, Lily, and thank all of you for listening to the Crossbow Catechist. This is the Archer signing off. So until next time, remember, keep practicing. And may the Holy Spirit of God fill your life with grace. Bye.